Welcome back to the book log. Today I'm going to be talking about Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. This is one of those books where it feels useful to know the context a little bit of who James Baldwin was and the moment of history in which he wrote it. James Baldwin was already becoming pretty famous in the 1950s as a Black American essayist who was pretty heavily associated with the civil rights movement at the time. He appeared frequently on television debates, he gave lectures around the country, he wrote essays directly engaging with race and religion and segregation and white supremacy and the police. He also personally knew and interacted with major civil rights figures. He met with Martin Luther King, he was close with Malcolm X, he was involved around events like the March on Washington. He occupied a somewhat unique role because he could move between these sort of activist circles and more mainstream literary spaces, and he's just generally one of the most important public intellectuals of his generation. All of that is to say that it's pretty fascinating to me that he chose to write this book, Giovanni's Room, which is a deeply intimate and psychological novel centered almost entirely on white gay men in Paris. James Baldwin reportedly later said that publishers warned him he was throwing away his career by writing about homosexuality instead of, kind of staying in his lane of being a black writer explaining race to America. But that's a part of what makes Giovanni's Room feel so interesting even now. James Baldwin refuses any category being imposed on him and instead writes about shame and loneliness and masculinity in a way that makes the book feel really ahead of its time. In terms of actual plot, this book is relatively simple. It follows a guy named David who is a young American man living in Paris while his fiancée Hella is away in Spain deciding whether or not she wants to marry him. While alone in the city, David begins an affair with an Italian bartender named Giovanni, and the two begin living together in Giovanni's cramped apartment, Giovanni's room, if you will. Right at the start of the novel, Baldwin reveals that something has gone horribly wrong and that Giovanni is set to be executed the following morning for some reason. And so the book largely unfolds as David looking back on their relationship and recounting what choices were made that led them to this point. Giovanni himself is a really interesting character and contrasts a lot with David. He's incredibly confident and open, he has such a warm personality, he's direct, he doesn't care about any risks that their relationship might entail, while David, on the other hand, is deeply conflicted and uncertain about his desires, and he is terrified of what they might mean for his own self-perception of his identity. The relationship is kind of intense for this reason, especially as they begin to live with each other in Giovanni's room. Really, the only other characters in the whole book are these two older gay men David and Giovanni spend some time with. There's Jacques, who is a businessman and acquaintance of David's, and Guillaume, the owner of the bar Giovanni works at. Neither of them are particularly sympathetic figures. Guillaume is described as this gross, self-serving lecher who, uses his money and position to extract sexual favors from younger men who need something from him. Jacques is described in pretty similar terms to that, but he's somewhat more complicated, I would say. He's lonely, he's more self-aware. He does occasionally say things that feel genuinely wise and profound about love and desire and whatnot, but he also pursues young men transactionally, and David is kind of revulsed by both of them because he's more or less afraid of turning into them someday. He's afraid that that's what his life would be like if he fully lets go and gives in to his feelings for Giovanni. In David's eyes, Jacques and Guillaume are old, they're undignified, they're kind of pitied by everyone, and he's afraid that that's what his future will look like. So as you can see, saying this is a book about the gay experience is a bit inaccurate, or it's at least an oversimplification. This book isn't really a tragedy about gay love being repressed in the 20th century and whatnot. It's more about David specifically, how he feels about himself. It's about him refusing to accept who he is and the psychological ramifications of that. It's a story about a man who is given a real choice, who is in fact given repeated chances to choose, and who keeps choosing wrong. Not that the politics of the time aren't a factor at all, but Giovanni doesn't die because society makes it impossible for him and David to be together. He dies basically because David abandons him. David chooses to not be with him. David is never unaware of what he feels for Giovanni. At various points, he describes their time together in Giovanni's room with a real kind of aching tenderness that makes it obvious he knows exactly what he has, but he never takes any action. The moment Hella comes back from Spain, David essentially just goes back to normal. He returns to the performance of being a straight American man abroad, and he leaves Giovanni with no warning, no honesty, or any explanation. Giovanni, who has already given up his old life, he has already organized his whole world around David, is now stranded. The whole last section of the book, where everyone's in Paris and David is trying to make sure Hella doesn't really know about Giovanni and Giovanni doesn't really know about Hella, it's so incredibly tense. David's guilt is just so palpable, and it ends up being justified, tragically enough, because after David leaves him, Giovanni spirals out of control. He gets fired from his job at the bar, and then in a confrontation with Guillaume, he ends up killing him. That's why Giovanni is tried and sentenced to death, and that's where the novel opens, with David alone the night before the execution, already drowning in the guilt of knowing that the chain of events that led Giovanni here started with him. Hella also leaves, and so he ends up saving nothing and destroying everything. It's not a very happy book. Coincidentally enough, just a couple months ago, I read The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway, and I feel like the two books are operating on somewhat of a similar wavelength, strangely enough. They're both pretty short novels about American expatriates living in Paris, and they're both about a main character who feels like they are perpetually running away from something. While The Sun Also Rises is more about a generation of people numbing themselves by drinking and never sitting still, Giovanni's Room is more about one guy actively lying to himself. But they both share this atmosphere of restless, directionless guilt, characters who can't bring themselves to confront what's actually wrong with them. Giovanni's Room is definitely the sadder book, though, by a pretty significant margin. It's almost downright dismal in some ways. I found it a bit hard to read at times, and not just because it's literally filled with a ton of untranslated French that I forced myself to look up every time I came across it, but because it's such a gut-punch train wreck and James Baldwin just forces you to watch it happen. That's obviously a big part of the appeal, I think. It's the kind of book that stays with you in your stomach for a while after you finish it. If you're looking for a book that makes you feel good, this is probably not it. But if you're looking for a book that makes you feel something, maybe even something bad, Giovanni's Room is hard to beat. I would give this book a solid 8.